I was a summer camp counselor at a remote campsite deep in the woods. I love spending time outdoors, and I was excited to help kids have a fun and memorable summer. One night after a long day of activities, I was sitting outside of my cabin enjoying the quiet and cool breeze. Suddenly, I heard a twig snap. I looked around, but I didn't see anyone. I brushed it off thinking that it had to be an animal. But then I heard footsteps. They were coming closer and closer, and I stood up and tried to see who it was, but it was too dark. I called out, "Hello, is anyone there?" No one answered. The footsteps stopped and there was silence. I started to feel uneasy, so I decided to go inside my cabin and lock the door for the night. I laid down on my bed and tried to calm myself down. That's when I heard scratching on the door. It was slow at first, but then it became more urgent. I froze. I didn't know what to do. I heard a voice whisper, "Let me in." I didn't know who it was, but I knew that I couldn't do that. I stayed quiet, hoping they would go away. After what seemed like an eternity, the scratching had stopped and it went silent. I didn't sleep that night. I was too scared. The next morning, I told my fellow counselors what had happened, and we had reported it to the camp director. We searched the area but found nothing. As the summer went on, I tried my best to push the incident out of my mind and focus on the campers and activities. But every time I was alone, the memory of that night came flooding back, and I couldn't help but feel uneasy. One afternoon, a group of campers and I were out on a hike, and as we were walking, I noticed something in the bushes. At first, I thought it was an animal, but then I saw a pair of eyes staring back at me. I froze. The eyes belonged to a man who was hiding in the bushes, watching us. I couldn't make out his face, but I knew that it had to be the same person who had scratched at my door. I gathered the campers and quickly led them back to the main campsite, where I reported the sighting to the director. We searched the area, but once again, the man was nowhere to be found. From that moment on, I was on high alert, and I made sure to never be alone and always kept a watchful eye. The summer continued on, and the last week of camp had finally arrived, and I was relieved that I had made it through without any further incidents. On the last night of camp, I was sitting around the campfire with the campers, sharing stories and making s'mores. It was a fun and lighthearted evening, a good way to end the summer. That was until I noticed somebody standing in the shadows. It was that man. He was standing there just watching us. As soon as I caught on and the other campers noticed the man as well, he dashed off into the woods, never to be seen again. To this day, I still don't know if it was some elaborate prank put on by the campers. If so, I have to give them props because they scared the crap out of me. But if it wasn't, that thought is much more unsettling. To give the context of where this story is based, I live in a smallish college town near a small to medium-sized city. The town itself doesn't have a lot of people and is mostly here to cater to the demand that comes from the college. Because of this, the stores around the college are mostly open 24/7, so that the college kids will be able to impulse buy whatever they like. The other big seller around here is gas. Of course, gas can be bought in the city, but being a town that is often gone through in order to get to the city, a lot of places will try to keep the price of gas slightly lower than any of the stations in the city. My story begins when I was working overnights in a gas station/liquor store, when I was doing part-time classes in college, but mostly doing classes online, so they wouldn't ruin my availability for a full-time job. The store that I worked at had only one person working on overnights for a long time. Even though a lot of people, especially girls, would complain of the lack of cameras and the fact that you don't always get the best people going into liquor stores in the middle of the night. The owner's hand was forced on one night, before I started working here, that a woman who came in to buy milk went outside to her car, only for a man to come up behind her and shove a gun to her back, demanding her money. She complied with him, and luckily he let her go. She ran into the store, sobbing hysterically, and though police arrived shortly after, he was never found. I personally preferred having 2 people on, even if there wasn't a safety issue. The night seemed to go by so much quicker when there was someone else there, and it was really nice that the person that I normally closed with and I got along so well. Overall, there were 4 overnight shift workers: Josh, Nick, Dixie, and myself. Dixie had another job and really was only working there as a favor to one of the managers, so she would only work 2 nights a week with either Josh or I. And then Josh and I worked together 3 nights a week, and Nick worked with Josh or I 2 nights a week. Dixie was really nice and fun to be around, but she didn't like the job or want to be there. Josh would get annoyed with her a lot for just standing behind the register while he did all of the work, but it was only 1 night a week, so he didn't complain too much. Nick, on the other hand, was a bit different. He worked there 5 days a week, just like Josh and I, but they never seemed to put him with one person more than 1 day a week. Nobody seemed to really like him or like working with him. Nick was a little off from the start. He was one of those people who told you his entire life story as soon as he met you, giving a bunch of really personal details that no one was really comfortable hearing. One thing he always seemed to talk about was the strain on his marriage. Apparently, he had a really bad drinking and drug problem for a very long time, and the drug part got better when he could switch over to weed, but he couldn't seem to get his drinking under control. He was hard to be around, but you kind of get used to some people in that kind of job being sketchy. I was there for almost 3 months when Nick's story seemed to escalate out of nowhere. He began telling people that when he was younger, he was diagnosed as a psychopath, and he had to take a bunch of pills for it every day so he wouldn't become violent. Not exactly what you want to hear from someone you're alone with in the middle of the night. But okay, we all have our problems, and some people get dealt a bad hand when it comes to mental illness. I myself have always struggled to get my anxiety and depression under control, and without medicine, I wouldn't be killing people by any means, but I would probably be hospitalized in danger to self categories. So, as creepy as that was, I assured him that a lot of people need to take medicine for some kind of illness, and as long as you stick to it and are honest with medical professionals, there's no reason you still can't do anything anyone else could do. He seemed pleased with this answer, and soon after the subject was turned to other things. He was especially cheery and nice to me after that for the next week or so, letting me know daily that he was taking his medicine and felt like things were going well with him. I would always answer enthusiastically, but I'm pretty sure everyone, especially Josh, was aware of how much I wish he would stop talking to me about it and would leave me alone. Josh had a wife and a daughter who was 2 at the time, so he couldn't help but see us younger girls through the eyes of what his daughter might potentially have to deal with when she was our age, and he seemed to go out of his way to end my conversations with Nick rather quickly, which I was grateful for and didn't really try to pretend that he liked Nick. It wasn't long before Nick started conversations with me going into details about why he was diagnosed, instead of how his medicine was working, which I won't get into here because a lot of it was very violent and sexual. I told him repeatedly that I didn't want to know about it, to which he would act like he understood and change the subject only for him to circle back to it about an hour later. When I confided to Dixie about it, she told me that she would take care of it and told her friend, which was the manager who asked her to come to work here. The manager couldn't really do much since I seemed to be the only one that he would talk to about these things, and told me to come to her again if he ever made me feel uncomfortable. It was starting to get increasingly tense for everyone working with him. After he was talked to by the manager, and soon enough, 2 other women who worked with him on the night shift reported comments he made to them to the manager. I was questioned, in which I agreed that all these statements made by the women were similar to the things that he had said to me. Nick was given a final warning and a write-up. The next couple of times that I saw him, he would go on rants about how people there were only reporting him because they didn't like him. I assumed he didn't know that I had been questioned too, and neither Josh or I had any intention to tell him. He got so angry at one point that he practically was in tears, saying how lucky those people were that he was on his meds, and what he would do to them if he wasn't. Luckily, it was about that point that his shift ended, and pretty much as soon as he clocked out, Josh told him that we had a lot of work to get done that night, so we didn't really have time to chat with him. He nodded and he walked out of the door without another word. Josh wasn't lying either. The truck had come in extremely late that day, so there was still quite a bit of things that needed to be put on the shelf. One thing that the earlier shifts never seemed to do, unless they absolutely had to, was stocking the drink coolers. It was true that it was easier to do it at night when there were a lot less customers, so it was annoying since we couldn't chat, but we just went with it. I can't remember the time that Josh went into the drink cooler, but it must have been pretty late, since we had been there for a while at that point. I was still focused on stocking the shelves and making sure everything looked full if we didn't have it, when the bell chimed signaling somebody had come in. I threw out a good evening, and that I would be right there since anybody that came in that late usually only wanted a pack of cigarettes or to pay for gas. I put down my box and I went to the register, slowing dramatically once I could see them. You guessed it. There was Nick, not looking at me, but leaning next to my register. I would be lying if I said that I had a reason to be afraid. It did turn out that he was drunk, but I couldn't detect it right away from the smell of booze that always seemed to linger in the air around there, and Josh was right on the other side of the wall. Even so, I considered for about 30 seconds if I should actually go, or if I should run into the cooler and get Josh. Nick wasn't a young, fit guy or anything. Years of drugs and drinking had aged him prematurely and ruined his body, but he was still intimidating to a 20-year-old girl. Unfortunately, Nick made the decision for me when, probably tired of waiting, turned towards me, and that's when I noticed immediately that there was something off about him. My voice was nothing more than a pathetic whisper when I asked him what he wanted. He just stared at me, nothing of his face to tell me what he was thinking. I was about to speak again when he spoke, barely intelligible because of his slurring. "He'd leave you alone in here." It took me a second to shake my head and tell him in a hopefully steady voice that Josh was in the cooler, and asked if he wanted me to go get him. Again, staring at me in silence. At this point, I didn't even care what he said. I just wanted him to say something. The silent staring was creeping me out. I asked with more force in my voice, "What do you want, Nick?" As soon as I had stopped speaking, he grinned at me, and in a disgusting, almost singing voice, he said, "You're lying. You are alone." He laughed and he took a step towards me, but stumbled, allowing me to take several steps back. At this point, I should have run to Josh, I should have called for him, anything. But I couldn't believe that I was reading the situation right. Nick was really weird, but I had never felt an actual danger around him before. He had never come off as more than a little unstable. He continued to come forward in slow, stumbling steps, telling me to, "Come here, I just want to talk." I kept out of his reach, telling him to back off and that I would hurt him if I had to. He thought that was pretty amusing and laughed loudly enough that Josh, who told me later, was what had caused him to look through the spaces of the racks and see what was going on. Josh was out of the door in a second and seemed to come out of nowhere, shoving himself in between Nick and I. They didn't even say anything, just stared each other down before Josh said in a stern tone, "I think you should leave now." Nick stared blankly for a moment and then scoffed, telling us that we couldn't take a joke. I was trying not to cry at this point. The only thing more terrifying about the situation was knowing that if Josh hadn't been there, and he had somehow caught me, I would have stood no chance against him. Josh left me standing with my back against the wall, corralling Nick to the door. Completely unexpected on both of our parts, Nick turned and took a swing at Josh. Luckily, either because he was drunk or just really uncoordinated, he missed Josh's face and Josh grabbed the back of his coat and brought him down, as he smashed his knee into Nick's stomach or chest area, I'm not sure which, and used the opportunity of his sputtering to drag him to the door and throw him out, locking it. Josh had just turned and told me to call the cops, as we heard this sickening crack behind him. We both jumped and looked at the door to find this big circle of glass. It's hard to explain, but if you've ever seen a movie of one or an actual car wreck when someone hits a windshield, but not hard enough to break through, and it turns white all around the point of impact, well, that's what the door looked like. Josh didn't have to tell me what to do this time. I ran to the register and grabbed my phone, going to the corner farthest away from the front door, and I held it on the floor. I didn't even notice at the time, but Josh told me later that when he turned to see the glass, that was the first time that he had noticed that Nick had a hunting knife in his other hand. The fact that he had tried to punch Josh instead of stab him is a mystery and a miracle. I was sobbing when the operator picked up the phone. I don't even know how she understood me. I was crying so hard. But between my distress and the sounds of Josh and Nick yelling at each other in the background, with loud smashes of Nick hitting the door, she got the urgency of the situation. She asked me where I was, and luckily, she knew the address because just as I got up to look at the receipt to see what the address was, the glass smashed. I dropped back to the floor and she told me that officers were already on the way, and to do whatever I could to get away or hide, even if I had to leave Josh. The hole wasn't big enough for him to get through, and he had made it by grabbing the ashtray from outside and throwing it at the part of the window he had been repeatedly punching, causing it to break through. He didn't make it to break through though. From that hole, he could reach the lock on the door. According to Josh, he walked to the door and put his mouth against the hole that he had just formed, and said something that I'm sobbing right now, even thinking about it. In that horrible sing-song voice that he had used the first time I talked to him that night, he said in such a happy tone, "They're never gonna find you two." Needless to say, as tough as he was acting, Josh was shitting bricks as much as I was. He was older than Nick in his mid-30s, but he was a beanpole and wasn't exactly known for his fighting skills. Even so, as soon as Nick unlocked and started to open the door, Josh slammed his body into it, knocking Nick backwards from the impact. Josh yelled for me to run, and even though my legs felt like they would give out at any moment, I ran behind him to the receiving doors in the back of the store. Nick was cursing and yelling for us as the door jingle went off. Josh slammed into the back door, cursing in pain, as he realized that it wouldn't open. We found out later that Nick had pushed the dumpster in front of the door, locking the wheels of it again before he came in. We seemed to both realize at once that he actually planned this out to kill us. Nick rounded the corner, still doing that awkward stumbling walk, though faster now. It at least gave me the time to slam the back room door shut and lock it. I was sitting in front of it, Josh bringing over anything he could find to barricade the door shut, when Nick had reached it. He must have heard me crying, because he kept calling out my name, telling me that I wasn't who he wanted. He would make sure that I died before I even felt the pain if I opened the door. He then started stabbing the door, screaming at me to open it. I screamed and moved when he stabbed it the first time, but Josh and I both moved immediately to hold it shut again. I remember Josh and I making eye contact. We were both crying by now, and I wanted so badly to say something to comfort him, but I couldn't think of anything to say. I had dropped my phone when I ran to hold the door shut, and neither of us could move to go get it. So, we had no idea how long until the police got there, and the door was made of wood, so it wouldn't last long against his body slams, and it offered no protection if his knife went into one of our hands. All I could think about was that I was going to die here, that my dog would never know why I didn't come home, that I would never get a degree and have enough money to actually start enjoying life, that all of the plans for the future my girlfriend and I had made would never happen. In the most anticlimactic and wonderful finish ever, it suddenly went silent. There were no police car alarms, no yelling, nothing. It was as if Nick had just vanished. Josh and I looked at each other, not even daring to breathe, listening for any signs of life on the other side of the door. We both slammed to the ground when a gunshot went off once, and then twice, and then a third time. There was more silence, and then a voice rang out, asking if anyone was here. We weren't sure if we should say anything, and then the voice continued with his name, and that he was an off-duty EMT who had been listening to the scanner. Josh got up and pushed the things aside in front of the door, opening it just enough to put his head out of it, and then it seemed like all the breath just left him. He opened the door and went out into the store, relief all over him. I ran and I grabbed my phone, seeing that the call had disconnected or the dispatcher had hung up. When I went out into the store where Josh and our rescuer was, he was in the middle of explaining how the police over the scanner were sending a bunch of cars, but they were all pretty far away, and he had a horrible feeling that they wouldn't get there in time when the dispatcher was telling them what they would find when they got there. He didn't want either of us to go outside until the police got there because, though Nick had been shot in the shoulder, he still had the knife when he took off. The EMT said that he would have run after him, but with the state that the store was in, he was scared that someone in here could be dying or hurt. The next 20 minutes were a blur. Josh and I were sitting on the floor hugging each other when the police got there. The EMT had called dispatch and told him of the new situation, and most of the cars that were coming to our location were diverted to looking for Nick. It was soon after that Josh got to use his phone to call his wife, and then she came right over, only bringing their daughter because he begged her to. He seemed to completely break down when he held his daughter and he hugged his wife. I had an extremely similar reaction when I finally got to go home, and came in to see my dog's body wiggling excitedly, proudly displaying his flamingo toy for me to have as a welcome home gift. Nick was found 2 weeks later in an old RV in the woods that he had been using to do his drinking and to do drugs, and so that his wife wouldn't catch him. Apparently, the reason that he had come after us was because he thought that the reason that Josh wanted him to leave so quickly was so he could call the owner again, and this time, the complaint would get him fired. Unknown to us, his wife had kicked him out 4 days before this happened, and was in the process of getting a restraining order against him over threatening texts and phone calls that she had been getting. He stated that his job was all that he had left, and Josh needed to be punished for trying to take it away from him. He said that I wasn't the target, and that he didn't want to have to kill me, but he knew that he had a much better chance of killing Josh with me there than Dixie, since Josh would be more likely to face him to protect me. Neither Josh or I called the owner or even a manager over his comments that night, though maybe we should have. It was disturbing what he was saying, in hindsight, but we were so used to him being a creep and saying really horrible things at that point, that it didn't even register to us that he could be serious about trying to hurt someone. I had known him for 3 months and Josh had known him for 6, and he had never done anything violent towards anyone. Everyone thought that he was just all talk. We also put faith in the fact that every employee has a background check on them before they were hired. So, it's not like Nick had ever been violent before. He took a plea deal so that the 2 counts of attempted murder would be dropped, and he would instead go to a mental hospital for offenders. The reason that I'm telling this now is that I got a call 2 weeks ago, notifying me that as long as there are no setbacks to his health status, Nick is set to be released on June 8th of this year. When I called Josh, he said he had received the same news the day before. Neither Josh or I work there anymore, and Josh has since moved away to another town on the other side of the city, and I have switched to going to college completely online, and I'm in a new place that I'm renting with a roommate. I don't think he'll come after either of us. I don't see how he could blame us for what happened. I've read so many of these stories, and it always seems like everyone is so prepared for what to do if they ever see the person they're writing about again. I don't think I would be any more prepared to face him this time than I was back then. I've had pretty intense nightmares ever since that day. But ever since I got that call, every time I close my eyes, all I can hear is that one sentence louder and clearer than I have ever heard it since it was actually said. They're never going to find you two. Nick, if it was true that you were diagnosed as a psychopath, I hope you're getting the help you need. You already destroyed my peace of mind, and even now, years later, I don't feel safe, especially at night. I don't believe in God, but I pray to anyone that's listening that we never meet again.